Okay. So I have a story to tell today, which is a seminar rather than a sort of educational exercise. So I want to talk about active colloids, but I want to talk about a specific aspect to do with the description in terms of Langevin equations, particularly the introduction of bias into the Langevin equations for active colloids. And this I'll present as a possible way to pursue this agenda here, which is reverse engineering of design principles. So what I'll talk about has just been published in PRE here. So there's at least one person in the audience who will learn nothing from my talk, which is the first author. And it's funded by these agencies. Okay, some motivation. So, and I should, as a caveat, I'm not going to be talking about hydrodynamics. I'm not going to be talking about fluid flow. I'm going to be talking about systems of interacting active particles of the kind that you can obtain experimentally, but are easy particularly to make on a computer, where, for instance, because of proximity to a wall, you maybe have self-propelled colloids, but you don't have to worry about their interacting via long-range hydrodynamic forces. So a standard question for those who have to write grant proposals is, why are we studying these materials, active systems? And one of the standard answers is, or several, as sort of listed here. So one of the reasons for looking at, for instance, colloids with self-propulsion is that we hope they might be directable or assemble into new types of structures, which may end up being, even without the self-propulsion, you may have a new state of organization which can be useful for some application or other. But also, if you create active materials which stay active, then there's the potential for new types of functionality there. And of course, there's always a biological motivation as well. But to progress beyond those sentences, which are what people often talk about, and there are a few examples of, there are certainly examples of each in the literature, but there's no very general framework. And one of the things which is missing from that general framework is an ability to generate design principles which link the microscopic interactions, say, between self-propelled colloidal particles to their emergent properties. So obviously some such principles have been discovered, but we need more ways of generating them. And it's a bit different from the way we're used to working in equilibrium systems, where we know that if you do statistical mechanics and you start changing the interaction of your particles, you'll get different structures in a way that you know how to get, in principle, from the microscopic interactions to the emergent behavior. That's harder here. Okay, so this is a simulation we did some years ago of self-propelled colloidal particles in a system which mimics an experimental setup where the speed of the particles is controlled by the intensity of a light field. So this is just an example of interacting self-propelled colloidal particles creating structure. So what we've done here is we've not illuminated these chevron-shaped pieces. So in those regions, the particles are not self-propelled. Everywhere else, they are. So you can see here that this has made a structure, this V-shaped object, which is then an obstacle for the self-propelled particles. And the result of that, a broken symmetry in space resulting from this funny obstacle, and the fact that the microscopic dynamics of the particles it breaks time reversal symmetry, is enough to give you a steady current. This is around periodic boundary conditions here. So that's an example of active colloidal particles as programmable materials. But as I say, we sort of made this up from thinking about various things that we already knew, not from any kind of systematic procedure. So what I want to do for the next half a talk is to step a bit back from that goal and talk about the understanding we have of at least one broad class of interacting active particles in terms of Langevin equations. And from Langevin equations, we can get, in principle, the statistics of paths, so the path weights for the time evolution of a many-body configuration as a function of time. And from that, I will talk about these tilted ensembles and something called the driven dynamics, and how these things can be implemented numerically. And then after that, I'll come back to this idea of reverse engineering of design principles with the use of a very simple example of that. Okay, so Langevin equation. So this is the simplest kind of equation one can write down for an overdamped active particle. Here is its coordinate. Now, this can be a coordinate of one particle, but up to just generalizing the notation, I can also think of that as a many-body configuration of a whole set of interacting particles. It obeys a Langevin equation with some kind of mobility, which in that case, if this is a long list of coordinates, is a matrix, a force, which could be the gradient of some potential, some external or interaction potential, but need not be. And here, lambda is unit white noise. D is a temperature-like parameter which controls the amount of random diffusive motion of the particles. And again, that is these in principle are all matrix operators. And this is a long list of noises if I have many degrees of freedom. So I'll talk about this as if it's a single particle. But bear in mind, there's always this extension to the many particle case, which is really just notational. And I'll highlight some cases where that does, however, make life a great deal more difficult. So one thing we often talk about in the context of active versus passive materials is the principle of detailed balance. In this context, the system is reversible. In other words, it behaves as if it has, or actually has, a Hamiltonian or a free energy functional, and therefore it behaves the same with movies running forwards and backwards if that mobility matrix and this diffusion matrix are related by one factor of kBt, or beta 1 over kt. But that is optional and won't generally be true in active systems. So that Langevin equation, which describes the time evolution of a configuration, x of t, can also be cast as a Fokker-Planck equation, which tells you about the evolving probability of being in configuration x at time t. So p is the probability of being in configuration x at time t. This is the Fokker-Planck equation. It has an operator on the right-hand side. It tells you the time evolution of p. Let's see what we have here. Well, this is written in an adjoint form. PS is the steady state probability density, so a stationary measure. This thing annihilates it. And this choice for that operator there is the one that corresponds to the preceding, or this Langevin equation. With a small twist that I don't want to get into. Here is a force. This plays the role of that drift force here, or interaction force. And that differs from this F by something which depends on what choice of discretization. Ito strato is the name for the cognoscenti of the Langevin equation. But we don't need to worry about that here. The idea is this is the primary description. We can implement it with any choice of time discretization in equations like this. So this is deliberately very general. From it, we can calculate the path weight. So this is not the probability of being in configuration x at time t. It's the probability of an entire trajectory x as a function of time t. This can be written in terms of a normalization and something called an action. And this is the basic schematic form. For the Langevin equation with just a single degree of freedom, it's exactly this. You have to read this in a more schematic way if I have lots of interacting degrees of freedom. So these are paths connecting some initial state at time 0 to a final state at time t. That t has nothing to do with temperature. So we can think about typical paths where there will be some deviation from the most likely path, which may be itself poorly defined. But we can also talk about atypical paths, and this is what I wanted to address in the next few bits of my talk, described by large deviations, in which this action, which is telling you the unlikelihood of the path, differs from the most probable value of the action by something which is increasing with time, is linear in t. So the best example of this that I can think of is to think of, I have an unbiased coin, and I want to know how probable it is to show heads 60% of the time indefinitely. So we're talking about very, very unlikely events. I'm tossing this coin billions and billions of times, but I can still define how unlikely it is to be systematically 60-40 instead of 50-50, which of course is the unbiased answer. That's the type of deviation we're talking about here. A system which doesn't just occasionally cross a nucleation barrier or do something unusual, but a system which, among all these possible evolutions, is systematically deviating from normal behavior. So this is a good example to keep in mind when we're talking about the kind of things that are happening in a minute. So these are called large deviations for obvious reasons. So there's a fundamental question which is well understood in the literature now, which is about how you compute how unlikely is a consistently atypical behavior like that. So we can define something which will tell us how untypical the system is. So this is the time integral, or the time average of something. And this is going to be, for instance, something which would normally be 0, but is not going to be 0, or would normally have some clear value like an average velocity and has the wrong value of the average velocity. In general, I can think of it as two pieces with a function of x dt and a function of x dx. This is a technical detail. So the point about this is that the probability density for observing this systematically wrong value of some characteristic path property is going to be exponential in time. And the coefficient here is called the rate function and depends on the actual value of that chosen number there. So there'll be examples in a minute. But before doing that, it's also possible to construct various ensembles that allow you to probe these atypical trajectories. The first one is the filtered ensemble, which is basically I just calculate my path weights, but with a delta function, that the untypical thing happens. So this just says, okay, I see if I'm tossing my coin, I just choose those sequences which have 60% heads, 40% tails, and I calculate with that filter what is the probability of observing them. That will still give me the relative probabilities of getting, 10 heads in a row or whatever, but with this filter which tells me that it's an unusual path. There's another way to do it, which is mathematically nicer, which is a bit like moving from the microcanonical to the canonical ensemble in statistical mechanics, which is just to put in an exponential bias here. So these path weights are biased by a field S, which is conjugate to this unlikely variable nu. Okay, so there are various things which are known about these ensembles. First one is that if I am in this regime of systematic unlikelihood, so for instance with my coin tossing, that I am in a regime where I'm systematically away from 50% heads, 50% tails, then the filtered and tilted ensembles become equivalent at long enough times. So that is very similar to the thermodynamic limit in statistical mechanics. And much more interestingly, the tilted ensemble has a Langevin equation or Fokker-Planck equation of its own. So, and here it is, this again is just a formal statement. If I know the time evolution operator for the main ensemble and I know the bias nu, which define these functions f and g here and here, then this is the operator, the time evolution operator with that funny gradient term that creates the tilted ensemble. This is usually called the driven process. And this has sort of come into the physics literature really in the last few years from a more mathematical place. Okay. So a few words about the driven process, then I will talk about examples and I will try to get away from this rather mathematical foundational stuff that I'm describing at the moment. So, okay, so it has a long history, going back to Doob in 1957, who for a particular case of a single particle undergoing Brownian motion with absorbing boundary conditions, constructed effectively this type of biasing. Because it has a Fokker-Planck equation, it has a Langevin equation. Other properties, you can think of it as a generalized maximum entropy strategy, if you like. It minimizes the relative entropy of the paths to the unbiased case while achieving the required unlikely 60-40 heads to tail ratio, for instance. So you can think of it as some kind of maximum entropy recipe for creating paths that achieve this target, and there's also an interpretation it has, which I won't go into in terms of optimal control processes. So the driven process has connections with other areas where you talk about strategies for achieving things or strategies for minimizing a cost function. So here's an example. So here's a Brownian particle in a washboard potential. So there's the potential, or rather there's the force. Obviously, this dotted line, if you can see it, is the potential. So it's just got its launch van motion. This is a typical trajectory, which is being repeated with periodic boundary conditions, in which the displacement of the particle, unsurprisingly, drifts systematically to the right. On the other hand, if I waited long enough, I could occasionally observe a trajectory which does this. And indeed, if I bias the dynamics by requiring a certain average velocity to the left, which is what this is now doing, then I generate motion like that. So that's the tilted or biased ensemble. So that's the kind of dynamics I'd see. Obviously, it depends on how much I want the velocity to the left to actually be. Let's see if I can get to the next slide here. Oops. Now, there was something in between. No? Okay. Okay, so here are your typical trajectories. There are these rare ones which you have now filtered out using the bias. This is the driven process. I don't want to go into much detail here, but it involves knowing the eigenfunction of the time evolution operator for the Brownian motion or the random motion in that potential. And for a one particle in one dimension, that's something that you might plausibly calculate. We'll see later that this raises problems for the many-body generalization of this. Okay, so, but anyway, this is, if you unwrap that equation here, this is the original potential, that is the potential in which the particle now moves. So this, you can think of the driven dynamics as Brownian motion in this potential here. So you can see it's, again, the height of these barriers, etc., will depend on how much bias you put on it, but it's a complicated transform of the original one. This depends on the parameters. This is controlling the mean speed in the particular way. Okay, so that's an example. So obviously, you know, this is a rare outcome for the original process, but it can still be looked at and it can be described and considered. So there's no free lunch, and here's the snag. The snag, which will be particularly relevant to us in the context of trying to think of interactions and processes that we can design into a system to achieve particular outcomes in the context of active colloids. So that's the Fokker-Planck equation in sort of this abstract sense, which we can write down in principle for any long list of interacting variables, any many-body system. I can then look at the Langevin equation, but it's arbitrarily complicated in general. So for one particle in one dimension, there's a limit to how complicated you can be, but for millions of interacting particles, this doesn't look promising. And in particular, I can't explicitly construct it without knowing this eigenfunction of the time evolution operator, effectively knowing the stationary state of the system explicitly already. So that means that, you know, addressing this question of constructing the biased dynamics is not going to be explicitly a helpful thing to do. But there's a route numerically, which is the cloning algorithm, which many of you will know. So here's my Langevin equation again. There's the action from it. This was just the expression of this bias that we talked about. Here is the tilted ensemble with the bias, whatever it is, giving me my 60-40 head-to-tail ratio or whatever I might choose. And the way that this can be done numerically is you do the Langevin dynamics. So you solve that equation forward in time with white noise here to get this factor, and then you deal with that factor in a separate step in the algorithm where you periodically do something else. This isn't, of course, the only way to simulate rare events or biased processes, but it's the one that makes most sense in this context, I think. Okay, so this is what you can do. Langevin cloning. So you do Langevin with the time step on large numbers of samples in parallel. And every time to time, so a larger time step, you evaluate what has happened to the value of this bias parameter since your last inspection. So you have, say, a whole bunch of systems flipping heads and tails, and you look at whether it's been close to 60-40 in the last few minutes, and if it has, you make multiple copies of that particular realization, and you kill off enough other copies to keep the total number of copies going the same. So that way you can basically force the dynamics to have this, say, 60-40 ratio on an indefinite basis by this kind of pruning. And this can be shown to create the tilted ensemble if you do it correctly, and therefore something which is equivalent to this filtered ensemble I mentioned previously. So here it is. It's sometimes thought, you can think of this as related to a genetic algorithm, but there's a very important difference if you know about genetic algorithms. If you have a genetic algorithm, you have some systems with rules, and you update the rules in a way that modifies the system to achieve the target behavior. There's no genome here. These systems are not obeying different rules. I'm just filtering the data by throwing away the unsuccessful ones and looking at the resulting paths. So this, because there's no genome, this isn't itself generating a strategy. It's not generating a new rule set as such, but I can look at the resulting paths from this filtering process and see whether they do interesting things that I can then build back into the dynamics. So here are the trajectories which have been selected by that, if this is a particularly good path. Okay, so this again is a way of generating this type of data from multiple samples where here the red paths are the survivors to the late times, and this again is just a picture of a typical trajectory. Okay, so that's been rather abstract. So what I'll do now is to return to this idea of whether using this type of thinking we can generate some strategies for identifying design principles in systems of self-propelled colloidal particles. So the idea is this one: observe the driven dynamics and then copy it. So let me elaborate a bit on that. So the naive thinking is this: we have a system of interacting particles with these complicated active interactions. I think of that as a design. It's something that I know about already. Then I can think about a target behavior and use that to define this function nu. And I'm just going to bias the trajectories to achieve the target behavior. So that's the same as, well, I said max ent again here. That's a strategy now. It's saying use the driven process to achieve the target behavior. So, and then that's your new design. So this is the naive idea. And I've already told you why this won't work. The driven process is totally intractable, has infinitely long range, infinitely many body interactions. So adopting it as a design is going to be difficult, because then I would have to create some interactions that realized that driven behavior. So that's the snag. And that's why this naive approach is not going to work. I have a completely unfeasible design from this. So there's an alternative, though, which is slightly better. At least I'm hoping it is. So you do all this. You simulate the system with the cloning algorithm, and you see how it behaves. So you just watch it. And then as you watch it, you may see it do things which you can think, I recognize that behavior. I know how to achieve that behavior with simple interactions. And this, at least, is what happened in the example that I'm going to describe later. So I can try to emulate the driven process, not by any kind of exact realization of it, but just to use it as a way of spotting strategies to achieve the target behavior by what are now essentially having simple interactions, which are the same as putting simple rather than arbitrarily complicated drift terms into the Fokker-Planck equations of motion. Okay, So let's contemplate that strategy in the framework of active colloidal particles. So I'm talking now about self-propelled colloidal particles, or could be bacteria, but that's not what I'll focus on particularly today. So there are, as you've probably heard in previous lectures in this course, various chemical strategies for making particles self-propelled. One is to put a Janus particle with a silver-gold hemisphere coatings of different metals in a bath of hydrogen peroxide. You can also use laser heating in a binary solvent for the same kind of particles. Both of these make the particles move in a systematic way along an arrow which is embedded in the body, and which then is subject to Brownian rotation. So the simplest microscopic model of that is this active Brownian particle model, which again may have come up before. What that creates is a persistent random walk here. At each point in time, if I only have one particle, it has a speed v, points in this direction u. So this in the two dimensions for simplicity, I can just think of with an angle. That has a rotational diffusion, and then the update rule for the position of the particle. If there are other forces acting on it, it responds to those with a certain mobility. It has this intrinsic propulsion speed, which looks like an additional force which is dragging it constantly along its internal arrow, and it has white noise to give you both the angular diffusion and also additional translational diffusion. Okay, and the canonical case which has been well studied here is when these interaction forces here are pairwise, central, repulsive, and non-aligning. In other words, they treat the spheres as spheres. They don't look at the angles between the particles. Basically, you just have these self-propelled spherical particles which bash into each other. So we know what happens in those cases, and again, these are movies that, well, this particular movie has sort of been shown thousands of times around the world at all kinds of seminars, conferences, and lectures, so I'm going to show it yet again. So these are Janus particles in peroxide. They happen to have a light-activated catalysis of the fuel, and so when you turn the light off, they behave with ordinary Brownian motion of passive particles, but as long as the light is on, they have the self-propulsion, and as you saw and see again now, this causes them to clump together and progress at least some of the way towards phase separation, crystallization in this particular case. If you take this kind of system, the key thing that's going on here is that you have particles whose basic internal dynamics breaks time reversal symmetry. But if you want to see that manifest itself in behavior at a large scale, you have to do something as well, which is to break the spatial symmetry of paths. We saw this in the movie I showed at the beginning, actually. So if such a particle interacts with an obstacle, and I think of reversing its path, what it does not do is the reverse of the path I've shown here. So if I just flip this over and watch it run the other way, it will just go straight past the obstacle. So this is, I'm speaking schematically now, but this is one of the ways in which the irreversibility of the underlying microscopic dynamics manifests itself at the large scale in single particle or collective behavior. There's one. This gives this consequence of rectification. This I alluded to in the previous movie as well. So if you put a set of metal barriers in the way of a tank of bacteria here, what you find is a buildup of bacteria on the right-hand side caused by the fact that bacteria that moving leftwards tend to get reflected by these asymmetric barriers. Ones which are moving to the right tend to get through. So this is called rectification, and this is one of the things which can go on in active colloidal particles, and something we'd like to understand the design of better. But the other is interaction among the particles themselves. So if I have two particles which happen to have a head-on collision here, what happens is you have to wait for them to rotate out of each other's way by Brownian motion. So they're like two kind of, or it's like a rugby scrum, actually. So they engage, and they then don't come apart easily. That looks like an attractive interaction. And that's why repulsive self-propelled particles can actually phase separate, as we saw in that movie there. So eventually they will rotate a bit and get out of each other's way. If I reverse that trajectory, then these things will not mutually align before coming apart, they'll just wriggle round. So you have a slow encounter in the forward direction and a fast one for the reverse direction. So that leads to this phenomenon of motility-induced phase separation. So this is closely related to what we saw in the experimental movies with the light-activated colloids. Not exactly the same. There's not much crystallization here. But anyway, that's the kind of thing that happens in interacting self-propelled colloidal particles. That's the same thing at a much larger scale. And this is what I showed you previously. Okay, so interaction with obstacles, interaction with each other. These are the ingredients that we understand. So I've already shown you this slide, but the point is now, okay, we have to get beyond those simple ideas to think about things which we can design in different ways. Right. So the example will be simple, and you might find it disappointing. But I think it is an interesting proof of principle that an approach like the one I've described might work. So think of this as collision avoidance in the particle system I've just showed you. Active Brownian particles with no alignment interactions but hardcore repulsions, or indeed collision promotion. These are things I might want to achieve, more likely avoidance than promotion. And what I'm going to do is show you how this biased ensemble method can suggest strategies for doing that. Okay, so here's the active Brownian particles again. I showed you all that. And here's the bias. Now, this isn't obvious. This choice of bias here is basically saying I'm introducing a function which notices whether the particle is moving along the direction of its arrow or not. So I'm going to call that W. This thing is, and so I'm scale that by V0. This thing you can think of as the active work. It's proportional to the force done by this, work done by this force here, if you think of this as a force. We know, of course, that in reality, self-propelled particles have some kind of swimming motion. They're not actually subject to an external force. But nonetheless, in this type of model, which, as I said, neglects hydrodynamic interactions, this is an established way of thinking about such particles. So if the particles are moving freely, then the motion in the direction of the internal propulsive force will be large. If they collide and crash into each other and form these arrested clusters, it will be much smaller. So one of these extremes, I have free motion. This is designed to be 1 in that limit, and it's 0 when all the particles are essentially unable to move. So that is a bias that one can think of as controlling the collisions or otherwise between the particles. So what's being shown here, and like all of the other movies I've shown you, these are thanks to this is borrowed. That is thanks to Takehiro Nomoto, who's in the audience. These are color-coded by the swimming direction, and this color coding is going to be copied on various movies I'll show you in a minute. So this is the unbiased dynamics at these densities are obviously not exactly matched. This is experimental, that's the simulation. And you can see the arrows, so the color coding is just helping you see which way the arrows are pointing. Okay. So, I think there's a movie here. Yes. So if you bias to small w, which means ineffective self-propulsion, in other words, lots of jamming, then you get something which looks basically like motility-induced phase separation, but you get it in a region of the phase diagram where it wouldn't otherwise happen. So this would normally be a uniform system which nonetheless undergoes phase separation, if you like, as a strategy for having lots of collisions, and you can see why that strategy might work. If you bias in the other direction, perhaps more interestingly, this is what you see. So this is a set of particles which have collisional interactions, no orientational interactions, biased to happen to have a very effective work done by this driving force. And you see how it's achieved that. It's basically line them all up. So polar order has emerged here without it ever being put into the underlying dynamics, but it emerges once you filter by the requirement of not having a lot of collisions. So here's the same movie again. On the left is a nice movie of, in fact, it's a vibrated granular material in this case, but it makes no difference to us. So that's a standard flocking system with alignment interactions. Particles, those needles, feel effectively an orientational interaction in this active environment. And on the right, what I just showed you. So that's an active polar flock. This is the filtered system with no alignment interactions, and obviously one is impersonating the other to a good extent. And you can see this at much lower density, both types of behavior, in fact. So it's interesting even on the left here that you've got a good alignment even in a regime where actually you'd have to move fairly far to have a collision. And on the right, again, if you bias towards ineffective activity so that everything is jammed together, you get this phase separation. Okay. Any more pictures? Oh, yes, these are at high density. So again, you can go to higher densities than I just showed you, and the same kind of things happen. Right. So just to comment, these are my equations of motion. What's happened when I filter? Well, what happens, of course, is well, the only things which are variables here, which are not deterministic, are these noises. And what it means is that after filtering, this and that no longer have zero mean, which is not surprising. So this one, after filtering, given that there's got to be a certain value of nu, is effectively telling me some kind of many-body talk. It's saying that the theta i's are not evolving independent of other people's angles. I've got something which depends on the coordinates and angles of other particles, and here is an effective drift. So either of these things could have dominated, and indeed that dominates when you are minimizing, well, when you're maximizing the active work. In other words, you're minimizing the collisions, and this appears to dominate in the other limit. So, I'm approaching the end of my story. If I consider the active Brownian particle system, which has no alignment interactions, and I consider the bias dynamics with the collision avoidance or enhancement as my bias, effectively this active work quantity, then if I think of that, what have I seen in those simulations there? What has that shown us? It's shown us that flocking is the max-end strategy for avoiding collisions. Attractions are the max-end strategy for creating collisions. And I mean, the max-end words there have a precise technical meaning. I mean, I can look at my trajectories and I can say I want trajectories which achieve this property, and this ensemble is the most likely ensemble to do that without any further information being applied. So it's a strategy. Now, does that become a design principle? Well, in these cases, clearly it does. It's rather trivial, in a sense. To avoid collisions, add alignment interactions. To maximize them, add attractions. So, possibly obvious, but not necessarily obvious, because I can think of a dozen other ways to avoid collisions. For instance, you can have particles which just move around normally, and when they come close to another particle only, they turn around and go in opposite directions. I mean, that's not a flocking interaction, but it's a perfectly good strategy for avoiding collisions, and it would be perfectly successful. But it's not the maximum entry strategy, and nor is it as easy a strategy to actually design in as polar alignment interactions. So, and likewise, if I wanted to maximize collisions, I could make dimers. I could just have pairs of particles which are co-aligned in opposite directions pretty much the whole time and rotate together. Again, that's a successful strategy for reducing the active work, but is not the Maxent strategy, and it's not the one that the filtered ensemble tells me, is easy to do in a very abstract sense of being dynamically close to the unbiased dynamics. So, of course, the big question is whether this type of method will generalize to anything that's more difficult than the example I've just shown you. And I think that remains to be seen, but I do think it's an interesting avenue. You can also think about this in a broader context. For instance, in social sciences, you're often, there's this whole, I don't know if France has one too, but in the UK, there's this whole government department which is dealing with what they call nudging people, which means issuing small incentives to change people's collective behaviors. So if you think of traffic management, it's not so different from what I just said. And indeed, you know, the idea of making particles move in the same direction is kind of rule zero of traffic management. It's the whole point of having a line down the middle of the road and say, on this side of the line, you drive one way, and that side of the drive the other, and that's definitely a good way of avoiding collisions. So in that sense, easy. On the other hand, there may be much more subtle things that you could do. Again, the idea being to first take the unperturbed system, generate with bias the behavior you want, and see how that was achieved, and then is that a workable strategy for achieving it. So that last slide is the same as my first slide, and thank you for your attention.